April space events, Artemis astronauts, a journey to Jupiter and more. If you are looking for space news in April, you won't have to wait long. On Monday, NASA will introduce the 4 astronauts who will travel on the Artemis II mission. The Artemis program, a successor to the Apollo missions of the 1960s and 70s, aims to return Americans to the moon later in the decade. Artemis II will send 3 American astronauts and 1 Canadian on a 10-day journey around the moon and back to Earth, launching as soon as 2024. The announcement of the mission's crew will occur at 11 a.m. Eastern Time on April 3. They will be the first humans to fly beyond low Earth orbit and toward the moon since the Apollo 17 mission concluded in 1972. In the middle of the month, a major European Space Agency mission will send a spacecraft on a long journey toward Jupiter, the Solar System's largest planet. The spacecraft, the Jupiter Icy Moons Explorer or JUICE, will focus on studying several of the gas giant's moons: Oceanic Europa, Massive Ganymede and Quirky Callisto. The mission is scheduled to lift off from Europe's spaceport in French Guiana on April 13. It will reach the Jovian system in 2031, spend 4 years performing various flybys and conclude with an orbit of Ganymede. Near the end of April, a moon landing may occur. iSpace, a private Japanese company, launched its M1 robotic lander in December, carrying cargo built by the space agencies of Japan and the United Arab Emirates. Landing on the moon is perilous, and attempts by India and an Israeli non-profit ended in crashes in 2019. If iSpace succeeds in touching down on the moon's surface in one piece, it will be the first private lunar mission to do so. The spacecraft reached lunar orbit on March 21 and the company has yet to announce the date of its landing attempt. Skygazers on Earth will have a chance to see one of the first major meteor showers of 2023 in April. The Lyrids meteor shower becomes active on April 15 and reaches peak activity on the night of April 22 into the morning of April 23. With the moon far from full that night, those with clear, dark skies have a shot at seeing fireballs streaking through the heavens. There will also be a total solar eclipse on April 20, but its path starts in the Indian Ocean, crossing over remote parts of Australia and Indonesia before ending elsewhere in the Asia-Pacific, so it won't be visible in the Western Hemisphere. You'll have to wait for October, when an annular eclipse will cross from the American West into South America. Continue reading the main story. Some important space events originally expected in April were recently postponed. The long-delayed first flight of Boeing's Starliner capsule carrying astronauts to the International Space Station has been moved to July. Boeing needs to complete certifications that the spacecraft is ready to fly, and traffic on the space station has added to the delays. A mission to launch a Japanese space telescope, XRISM, also faces delays tied to a launch failure in March of Japan's new H3 rocket, according to Space News. Another launch facing delays is the first orbital trip of Starship, SpaceX's massive reusable rocket. SpaceX officials had suggested a launch in March ahead of a partly successful ground test of the rocket's engines in February. The company's founder, Elon Musk, suggested on Twitter that an April flight was possible. How 3 NASA missions could send astronauts back to the moon. Since the final Apollo mission in 1972, the moon has been undisturbed by human footsteps, but that may soon change. NASA plans to send astronauts back to the moon this decade in a series of space flights called the Artemis program. The first mission, which concluded Sunday, was a test flight with no crew members aboard. Eventually, though no earlier than 2025, NASA plans to send astronauts for a week-long stay near the moon's south pole. The crew will include the first woman and the first person of color to walk on the moon, NASA said. 1. Departure. The Orion spacecraft and the Space Launch System rocket launched from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. 2. Moon orbit. Orion orbited the moon about 43,000 miles above the moon's surface. 3. Return. In preparation for splashdown, the crew module separated from the service module. The crew capsule splashed down in the Pacific Ocean with the help of parachutes. Instead of crew members, the first Artemis mission carried 3 mannequins named Helga, Zohar and Commander Munikin Campos. Helga and Zohar contain plastic models of radiation-sensitive organs, such as the uterus and the lungs, so that scientists can study how radiation in space may affect future astronauts. The 3 mannequins traveled inside a spacecraft called Orion, specially designed to protect human crew members and experiments in space. Orion launched into space atop the Space Launch System, a new rocket that stands 322 feet tall and weighs almost 6 million pounds. The Space Launch System used in Artemis I is one of the most powerful rockets ever developed by NASA and can send a payload of almost 60,000 pounds to the moon. Artemis I, the second mission, will carry 4 astronauts around the moon and back to Earth. The cruise trip will take them about 4,600 miles above the far side of the moon. Depending on the position of the moon during the mission, this could be the furthest distance into the solar system that astronauts have ever traveled. After launch, the astronauts will enter Earth's orbit, perform a systems check and make solar panel adjustments. While 2 crew members land on the surface of the moon, Orion and the 2 remaining astronauts will stay in orbit. Moon landing. The lunar lander will undock from Orion and then descend into a lower orbit before landing near the moon's south pole. 4. Moon launch. After a week-long mission on the surface, the astronauts will ascend into a low lunar orbit before docking to Orion. 5. In addition to returning the crew to Earth, the Orion crew may also bring back scientific samples for future testing. In Artemis I, astronauts will land a SpaceX Starship near the moon's south pole while Orion waits in lunar orbit. The polar region is home to mysterious, permanently shadowed craters that have not seen sunlight in billions of years. The chemicals frozen inside could help scientists understand more about the history of the moon and the solar system. If the Artemis I mission succeeds, NASA plans to regularly send crews to the moon. Its plans include a lunar base camp and an outpost spacecraft called Gateway stationed in lunar orbit. Japanese company's lunar lander launches to the moon. The company, iSpace, is carrying a rover from the United Arab Emirates, a Japanese robot and other cargo in its bid to possibly be the first commercial lander to reach the moon. Another day, another rocket launched by SpaceX and another spacecraft going to the moon. All those seem commonplace these days. SpaceX has already launched its Falcon 9 rocket more than 50 times this year. NASA's Artemis I, an uncrewed test flight that is a precursor to future astronaut missions, returned to Earth after orbiting the moon. Capstone, a small NASA-sponsored CubeSat, is still orbiting the moon after being launched in June. A robotic South Korean orbiter, Danri, was launched to the moon in August, but the lunar lander that was carried by a Falcon 9 rocket from Cape Canaveral, Fla, on Sunday is not a NASA mission. Instead, known as M1, it is from a small Japanese company, iSpace. The payloads on M1 include a rover from the United Arab Emirates and a small 2-wheeled Transformers-like robot for the Japanese Space Agency. While the mission lifted off at 2:38 a.m. Eastern Time, you'll have to wait until April to see if these robotic explorers make it there, possibly becoming the first cargo successfully carried to the lunar surface by a private company. What is iSpace and what is it sending to the moon? The company started as one of the competitors for the Google Lunar X Prize, a competition that offered a $20 million prize for the first private spacecraft to land on the moon, travel 500 meters and send back video from the lunar surface. At the time, the Japanese group, known as Team Hakuto, focused on developing a rover, and it was to rely on a competing team from India for the ride to the surface of the moon. If that had worked, the 2 rovers would have been racing to see which could travel the 500 meters first. However, the Lunar X Prize expired before any of the teams made it to the launch pad. An Israeli competitor, SpaceX, launched its craft in 2019, but its moon lander crashed on the lunar surface. The group known as Team Hakuto evolved into a space, attracting sizable investment, and the company plans to launch a series of commercial moon landers in the coming years. For Sunday's mission, the payloads include the Rashid lunar rover from the Mohammed bin Rashid Space Center in Dubai, a two-wheeled transformable lunar robot from JAXA, the Japanese space agency, a test module for a solid-state battery from NGK Sparkplug Company, an artificial intelligence flight computer, and 360-degree cameras from Canadensis Aerospace. As a vestige of its Lunar X Prize heritage, it is also carrying a panel engraved with the names of people who provided crowdfunding support and a music disc with a song performed by the Japanese rock band Sokan Action. The Japanese company's lander is not the only passenger on Sunday's flight. A secondary payload on the Falcon 9 is a small NASA mission, Lunar Flashlight, which is to enter an elliptical orbit around the moon and use an infrared laser to probe the deep, dark craters at the moon's polar regions. Why will it take a space so long to get to the moon? Much like some other recent moon missions, M1 is taking a circuitous, energy-efficient trip to the moon and will not land.